History hides a brutal secret. Every century crowned a villain so feared, they reshaped the world through violence and fear. In part 1, we uncovered some of them, but what if I told you we left out the worst? The exiles who built empires, the kings who betrayed God, the conquerors who erased civilizations. These are the villains your teachers never warned you about. And once you see them, you'll realize evil doesn't die, it only changes its face. So buckle in, because this is part 2 of every century's biggest villain explained. The 10th century, Eric the Red. The Viking Age was already an era of raiders and warriors, but Eric the Red stood apart. Born in Norway, he was exiled as a young man for violent acts even other Vikings couldn't accept. But exile didn't break him. It turned him into something far more dangerous. Sailing west, Eric stumbled upon a massive icy land. To attract followers, he branded it Greenland, twisting truth into a lure. Hundreds followed him across the sea, only to find harsh winters, scarce food, and a leader who ruled through fear. Stories from the sagas describe Eric as ruthless, quick to violence, and unyielding in his grip over the fragile new colonies. Anyone who challenged him faced his blade. His cruelty and charisma fused into power, leaving Greenland forever marked by turmoil and conflict. What made Eric the Red so infamous wasn't just founding a colony, it was proving that even at the edge of the known world, terror could be exported and rebranded as opportunity. But the next century's villain wouldn't simply trick people with promises. He would cross the sea and burn an entire nation into submission. 11th century, William the Conqueror. The 11th century crowned a man whose ambition redrew the map of Europe, William the Conqueror. Born illegitimate, mocked as the bastard Duke of Normandy, William clawed his way to power through sheer force of will. But his hunger didn't stop with Normandy. His eyes locked on England. In 1066, he launched one of history's most legendary invasions. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a clash of armies, it was the collapse of an entire kingdom. Villages burned, thousands were cut down, and the English nobility was erased almost overnight. William replaced them with loyal Norman lords, reshaping culture, language, and laws in ways still felt today. His most infamous act came after the harrying of the North. Rebellions in northern England were met with scorched earth tactics so brutal that entire regions starved. Chroniclers wrote of fields turned to wasteland, families scattered, and silence where once there had been thriving towns. William wasn't only a conqueror, he was an architect of fear, and his rise set the stage for a Europe defined by fire and iron. But the next villain would make even crusaders question if mercy had any place on the battlefield. 12th century, Frederick Barbarossa. The 12th century forged a legend in armor, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. To his allies, he was the red-bearded symbol of strength. To his enemies, he was the iron fist of the Holy Roman Empire. His reign stretched across Germany and Italy, but his appetite for power bled far beyond his borders. Barbarossa waged relentless wars to crush rebellious cities in northern Italy. When Milan defied him, he ordered it razed. The city's walls torn down, its people scattered, its pride broken. Mercy was never part of his vocabulary. His justice was fire and rubble. And then came the Crusades. Barbarossa marched east with one of the largest European armies ever assembled, determined to carve his place in the Holy Land. Wherever he moved, villages emptied, and survival often meant submission. He carried the banner of faith, but ruled with fear. Frederick Barbarossa is remembered as both hero and destroyer, proof that history can glorify a man even as he leaves a trail of ashes. The next century's villain wouldn't march with banners. He would sail with cannons and turn entire seas into his empire. 13th century, Alfonso de Albuquerque. The 13th century pushed Europe's power far beyond its own shores, and no figure embodied this ruthless expansion more than Alfonso de Albuquerque. A master of the sea, he became the architect of Portugal's empire in Asia. But his victories weren't built on trade alone. They were built on intimidation and fire. Albuquerque seized key ports along the Indian Ocean, including Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. To secure them, he unleashed massacres that terrified local populations into submission. Accounts describe executions, forced conversions, and entire communities uprooted so that Portuguese rule could never be challenged. He was praised back home as a genius strategist, a man who secured Europe's dominance in the East. Yet in the lands he conquered, his name carried a different meaning, one tied to bloodshed, broken alliances, and cultural destruction. Albuquerque's empire was less about exploration and more about domination at any cost. His legacy proves that oceans were no longer shields against European ambition. And soon in the 14th century, a king would show the world that betrayal wasn't limited to enemies. Sometimes it was aimed at God's own knights. 14th century King Philip IV of France. The 14th century gave rise to a king whose hunger for wealth and power made even sacred vows expendable. Philip IV of France, remembered as Philip the Fair, his nickname spoke of his appearance, not his rule. Behind the crown was a monarch willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. His most notorious act was against the Knights Templar, once the most powerful military order in Christendom. Philip, drowning in debt, accused them of heresy. Hundreds were arrested in a single night. Their leaders were tortured, forced into false confessions, and burnt at the stake. The order that had defended Crusader kingdoms was wiped from history in one king's pursuit of gold. Philip also used relentless taxation to crush rivals, bankrupting merchants, nobles, and even the church. To his subjects, his reign meant fear of royal justice and empty coffers. He proved that no alliance, no faith, and no oath was safe when a king placed ambition above honor. And in the next century, ambition would take human form again, this time as a prince who turned Italy into his personal chessboard. 15th century Cesare Borgia. The 15th century belonged to Italy's tangled web of city-states, and within it rose a man who made betrayal an art form, Cesare Borgia. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare traded the cloth for the sword, carving out his own dominion with poisonings, secret plots, and calculated terror. Cesare allied with powerful families only to eliminate them when their usefulness ended. Entire households vanished overnight under his schemes. Rival lords who once shared his table found themselves eliminated, silenced, or exiled. His brutality was matched by brilliance. He fought with both steel and deception, making him almost untouchable. So ruthless was his ambition that Niccolò Machiavelli used him as the living model for The Prince, a handbook on power still debated today. To Machiavelli, Cesare represented the perfect ruler, feared, cunning, and willing to discard morality for control. But Cesare's empire of shadows couldn't last. Disease struck him down young, leaving behind the blueprint for tyranny that would inspire rulers for centuries. And in the next century, one man would sail west, topple a civilization, and prove that betrayal could destroy empires. The 16th century, Hernán Cortés. The 16th century witnessed a clash that rewrote the fate of an entire continent, and at the center was Hernán Cortés. Arriving in the Americas with little more than ambition and steel, he encountered the mighty Aztec Empire. To them, he came as a guest. To history, he became their destroyer. Cortés used diplomacy as a mask, forging alliances with tribes who hated Aztec rule. But beneath the handshakes was a plan of betrayal. When he finally marched to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, he turned hostility into conquest. Montezuma, the emperor, was taken hostage, and chaos soon followed. Battles and disease devastated the Aztec world, leaving temples in ruins and millions under Spanish control. What had been one of the greatest civilizations on Earth was reduced to ashes within a few short years. To Spain, Cortés returned a hero, paraded as a man who expanded the empire. To the descendants of the Aztecs, his name became a reminder of treachery and loss. And if Cortés proved a single man could topple an empire, the 17th century would show how another man shattered one with nothing but a trap. 17th century, Francisco Pizarro. The 17th century crowned another conquistador who rivaled Cortés in ruthlessness. Francisco Pizarro. Where Cortés broke the Aztecs, Pizarro set his sights on the Inca Empire, a civilization stretched across the Andes with cities of gold and armies in the tens of thousands. In 1532, he lured the Inca emperor Atahualpa into a supposed meeting of peace. What followed was one of history's most infamous traps. Spanish soldiers ambushed the emperor's guard, overwhelming thousands in minutes, while Pizarro seized Atahualpa alive. With their leader in chains, the Inca world unraveled. The ransom Atahualpa offered was staggering. Rooms filled floor to ceiling with gold and silver. Pizarro took it all, then executed him anyway. The empire collapsed, leaving Spain in control of vast riches, and the Inca people crushed under colonial rule. Pizarro's cunning and betrayal proved that empires could fall not only to armies, but to deception. And while his treachery brought wealth to Europe, the next century's villain would show how ideology itself, not steel or gold, could turn a revolution into a nightmare. 18th century, Maximilien Robespierre. The 18th century gave us a man who preached liberty with one hand and delivered terror with the other. Maximilien Robespierre rose as the voice of the French Revolution, calling for equality, justice, and the end of tyranny. Crowds cheered his speeches, believing he was the guardian of freedom. But once in power, Robespierre turned those ideals into weapons. He oversaw the reign of terror, where suspicion was enough to condemn thousands to the guillotine. Nobles, priests, even fellow revolutionaries, no one was safe from his tribunals. What began as a fight for rights descended into fear and silence, with Paris haunted by the constant fall of the blade. Robespierre insisted it was all for the sake of the Republic. Yet in protecting the revolution, he destroyed its soul. His downfall came swiftly, and even his allies realized that survival meant turning against him. He followed his victims to the guillotine, consumed by the very terror he created. He showed the world how quickly ideals could rot into violence. And as Europe rebuilt from the terror, the 19th century produced a queen whose reign made her people live in constant fear of survival itself. 19th century, Ranavalona I of Madagascar. The 19th century witnessed a queen whose rule became one of the most terrifying in African history. Ranavalona I of Madagascar, she seized the throne after the death of her husband and quickly made it clear that mercy had no place in her kingdom. Ranavalona turned Madagascar into an isolated fortress. Foreigners were expelled, missionaries executed, and her own subjects forced into harsh labor. Thousands perished constructing royal projects, while countless others perished in loyalty tests so cruel that survival often came down to chance. One of the most feared practices under her reign was the Tangena ordeal, a poisonous trial by ordeal where the accused were forced to swallow poison to prove innocence. Entire villages were wiped out through this ritual. For nearly 33 years, Ranavalona ruled by fear, leaving the island scarred and cut off from the outside world. To her, isolation was strength. To her people, it was suffocation. By the time her reign ended, Madagascar's population had been cut nearly in half. Yet despite the devastation, her power was confined to one island. The next villain would not be limited by borders. His rule stretched over continents. His terror reached into every home, and his name still casts a shadow over the 20th century. Across 1,000 years, every century found its villain, men and women who bent faith, empire, and even revolution to their will. Different centuries, different names, but the pattern is the same. Ambition without restraint becomes destruction without mercy. These villains remind us that history isn't only shaped by visionaries and heroes. It is also twisted by those who rule through intimidation, betrayal, and cruelty. So now the question is yours. Which of these villains left the darkest mark on humanity? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Part 3 may take us into villains history books barely mentioned, but their shadows are still with us today.